Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Gospel Rebel, where we equip you to stand firm in your faith as a true man of God. In a society where authentic biblical manhood is under attack, we empower you to rise above the lies and oppression to embrace the gospel as the natural rebel against darkness. And now, here's your host, Rich Miller.
Hey guys, welcome to the next segment of the Gospel Rebel podcast. In our last episode, we covered a man and a wife, changing the dynamic, getting into a church, understanding what marriage is about. Well, after that, typically the question is, I can't get my husband in church. Well, I can understand that. I'm going to give you some basic reasons why. Number one, men do not like organized religion. And I can certainly understand that. I've been on the receiving end of that. However, there needs to be some understanding about organized religion. Number one, Jesus founded the church on his blood, and he died for the church. The apostles came along and organized it. In other words, they gave it some structure through the epistles that were written and through the pastoral epistles that were written. And so you have teachers, pastors in the church, deacons, and Paul gave some structure to it for organization. Now, when we don't have a brick and mortar building in your local church, and remember, God is about local. We had local synagogues in the Old Testament Jewish culture, and that concept was brought forth with local churches because power is local. And if we don't understand local, that church is supposed to be local for the next generation. For example, say I go to church, but I really don't go to church. I go to a Bible study at a golf club. And we have Bible study there every Sunday. Okay. The problem with that is this. Number one, how are we going to do baptismals? Number two, how we're going to support missionaries. Number three, how we're going to do the work of the ministry from there. Sooner or later, the golf course owner is going to say, "Hey, look, you're disrupting. Got too many people coming to church. The parking lot's full, et cetera, et cetera." Now that may sound silly, but many people say, "I go to church," when they really don't go to church. And so that concept is there. So that what happens if that golf course shuts down for the next generation? So that's why you have an organized religion and a local place that goes from generation to generation. That church building is there for the next generation. And God put us there to support it so the next generation of people will have a local church to go to and worship the Lord. And so organized religion is part of God's program. It's God's way of impacting humanity through that organization, through that church. And so it's important for us to understand that. Now, the other thing to understand is why men do not go to church is identity of identifying with a man behind the pulpit. I totally get that. As a young man, I got back in church 21, 22 years old. I was in law enforcement, working out, martial arts. And the guys behind the pulpit that I saw were either grossly overweight or they were old. And so I had trouble identifying with men behind the pulpit. And so that was a difficult thing. I never felt like there was a camaraderie there or something to attach to, so to speak. And so, you got young men out there, they're looking for purpose. They're looking for a place to identify. So are grown men. And so we have to understand that masculinity has been under attack in this country for quite some time. And most of your preachers today are in movies are portrayed as some sissified looking fellow behind the pulpit. And so it's hard for men to get involved in that and follow something like that. So men have to identify with other men. So finding that church is important. They're out there. So you just have to pray and ask around, see what's out there. So understand this. So and the other thing is this: not only is there identifying issues with the guys behind the pulpit, but in the pew as well, because Jesus today, the third reason is Jesus has been preached in a feminized way. And Jesus is far from being a sissy, so to speak. And we can see this in his name. His name is Alpha. He's Alpha and Omega. He's Alpha. And alphas get alphas. Alphas are not intimidated by alphas. Alphas are not concerned with other alphas. We identify when we walk in the room. We know who's who. We're good with that. Alphas are comfortable being around alphas, and Jesus was alpha. And we can see that in his behavior at times. In John chapter number 2, the Bible says he made a scourge or a whip because he saw money changers in the temple, and they were making merchandise in the church. That's something Jesus was not in favor of at all, and he had premeditated act of male aggression here. I want you to get a hold of that. He had a premeditated act of male aggression in a righteous way. In other words, he went over and sat down and made a whip. In other words, he took the time, and as he was making that whip, he knew what he was doing. It wasn't reactionary. And so he's making this whip, and that's an act of male aggression. And what he was doing, he was standing against something that was hurting people physically, obviously because there was no move of God there, but also spiritually. So he was resisting the powers that be. Now you transition over to Mark chapter number 3, you see that on a personal level where he's in the synagogue, and he's about to heal a man that has a withered hand in Mark chapter number 3. And the Bible says that the Pharisees, this is very key, that they were watching him. In other words, Jesus knew they were watching him, and he was about to heal somebody anyway, on purpose, intentionally. Now the Pharisees were the power of the day. And here you have Jesus all by himself, lone wolf, alpha male, resisting the establishment. Say, hey, this person needs help. They need some spiritual insight. They also need physical healing. I'm going to do this right in front of you, and resisting that establishment for the day. That's not a sissified Jesus. And what he did, on top of that, he stood that man up. He told him to stand up so they could see what he was about to do for this man. In other words, he was like in your face with this. And then not only that, the next thing he said, he asked them a question. In other words, he says, I got a question for you. You see this manhood here, or this alpha spirit coming out of him and resisting the powers that be. We would call that a sheepdog today, or a wolf dog today, so to speak. Someone who's protecting and standing for truth. He was standing for God's truth. And so we see that. And not only did he ask them a question, we have to understand this, that Jesus was not this guy who just passively walked by somebody who needed help. In other words, he just didn't keep his mouth shut and go along to get along. He stood his ground, and we see that alpha spirit there. And when Jesus healed him, Jesus healed the man, and he also, the Bible says in verse 5, Mark 3, that Jesus looked upon them with anger. In other words, he gave them that alpha look. Okay? He looked upon them with anger, didn't commit an anger of violence, anything violent, but he did so with anger. In other words, that's not a Jesus is preached today, okay? There's a place, the Bible says, be angry, but sin not. And so we see this man with this alpha spirit conducting business in a righteous way. And men do not identify with sissy. They identify with other men. And so when they go into church, they need to identify with men in the church that are not sissified. There's not a sissy behind the pulpit. And also, they have to identify with the Jesus that they're following. And this sissified Jesus, men are not going to follow this sissified Jesus. And so we see this here. And you may say, well, that's just one word you're using. No, these are real instances in a Bible. Jesus mentally sitting down, premeditating, making a whip. He's about to use this whip, and then he's challenging the establishment of the day. And also there's another aspect of it to understand. This is something men like to be a part of. This is the atmosphere men like to be a part of. This is why men do not go to church today, because this is not understood. This is not something that it's not a culture in the church. It's not a place where men can be men. Jesus hung around alphas. You say, well, what do you mean by that? You have Peter, James, and John. Peter was a man's kind of a man. When they caught all those fish in the net, Peter went over there, and he was that guy that was pulling the net in all by himself. He was here today. He'd be that country boy driving that 4-wheel drive truck and just, handling business. And then you have James and John. Now, Jesus gave them a name that was very interesting. He called them the sons of thunder. In other words, they were very zealous, very strong, bold about their stand for God. They were sons of thunder. Now, what I'm saying is alphas hang around alphas. Alphas understand alphas. And so what you see here is Jesus alpha hanging around 3 alphas. In other words, Peter, James, and John, those 3 were always a part of his inner circle. Those are his go-to guys. That needed, when he needed to get something done or something spiritual insight, because he wanted to teach those guys to teach other guys. And so we need alpha guys in churches that are getting spiritual concepts so they can turn around and teach other men. Instead of repelling men from church, we need to get men invited into a real Bible-believing church where there's true doctrine, because that's the meat of the word, and men are meat eaters, and they're not into this emotionalism culture of church. And so there are churches out there, ladies. I hope you can get you and your husband into a Bible-believing church. If you're in the middle Georgia area, we'd love to have you at Enon. That's ENON Baptist. We're located between Forsyth and Monticello, 28 minutes north of Macon, 15 minutes south of Butts County, southeast of Butts County, and we'd love to have you guys. God bless you.
If you enjoy this content, please subscribe on YouTube and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you know other men who are ready to take a stand, well, share this podcast with them and invite them to join our gospel rebellion. Thanks again for joining us for this episode, and we look forward to seeing you next time right here on the Gospel Rebel.